Well, hello and welcome back to our Through the Bible series. Today we are exploring the character of Abraham. And this is a bit of a tricky one. I was initially going to be posting these videos once a week, but the story of Abraham covers about a dozen chapters of the book of Genesis, and it just required a little bit more time to go into this. And so because we're not just covering the character of Abraham, we're also covering his nephew Lot and his sons Ishmael and Isaac. And so there's a lot of crossing paths in the story of Abraham before we move over to our next major character, Jacob, which is also a fairly long set of chapters. So if you're following along with our Bible reading plan, just feel free to go at your own pace, whatever is comfortable for you. Just like I'm doing with this video. I actually recorded this once before and I'm now re-recording it because I just wanted to make sure that we were dotting all of our I's and crossing all of our T's as we read through chapter by chapter in the Bible. So let's go ahead and jump in, starting with chapter 12 all the way through 24. So we're coming out of the Tower of Babel narrative, which sets up this country of Babylon. And out of that country comes Abraham's family. So this is our transition from a more abstract set of passages. Is it mythology? Is it literal? Is it poetry? We're not really sure. It's a really big combination of things in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. But then as we continue with the story of Abraham, here known as Abram, we are getting a little more concrete as to what we can reliably say is historical. So Abram is traveling with his wife Sarai, later to be known as Sarah, and they are traveling through Egypt. And Abraham actually comes across as a bit of a coward in these early passages because he's scared that he's going to get killed. And so he passes Sarai off as his sister. And then a lot of bad things happen to the Pharaoh because Sarai is married to Abram. So then Pharaoh accuses Abram, "What are you doing? Why have you told me that this is your sister when this is your wife?" It's a very confusing set of passages, but then Pharaoh just says, "Take her and go. Get out of here, please. Leave me alone. I do not want any trouble." So Abram and Sarai leave Egypt, and they take their nephew Lot with them. And things come to a point where it's too logistically difficult to keep traveling together. And so they come to a fork in the road, and Abram says, "Hey, wherever you go, I will go the opposite way. We'll part ways, we'll still be family, but hey, logistically, we got to make sure that we're settling in different areas because our herds, our people are starting to overlap, and this is starting to get logistically difficult." And Lot decides to move close to a city called Sodom, which is known for its immorality, where Abram decides to go the opposite way. And so we're seeing another split between two characters, one choosing a path that leads to destruction and another that leads to what will eventually be a promised land, a covenant land for Abraham's descendants. And this decision is already starting to pay off poorly for Lot. Sodom is in the middle of a war and ends up getting seized, and Lot along with it. And Abram has to come in and save the day and actually turn the tide of this war. And this is when we start to see Abram kind of become this more righteous sort of figure. But he ends up receiving this blessing from Melchizedek, who also claims to worship the same God as Abram. And it's the only time that we see this character in the Old Testament. He kind of shows up, he blesses Abraham, and then he leaves. And it's odd because typically in the Old Testament, what we're following is God working through the family of Abraham. And yet here's this king and priest of the God Most High who doesn't seem to be connected to Abram's family at all. It's a fun little Easter egg to explore this idea of, okay, so God is primarily working through the family of Abram, but that's not all God is doing. And so even though God has his chosen people that he's working through, the question that is asked but not answered is, what else is God doing behind the scenes? And now in chapter 15, we see the beginnings of these promises that God is making to Abram. He sees the righteous thing that he did for Lot, and he was blessed through Melchizedek. And God says that Abram is righteous. Or in verse 6, it says, Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. And so God promises that Abram will have an heir who is not Lot, because Lot has gone off and he's starting to drift away from God. But there's going to be a descendant that comes from Abram that will follow God. But in chapter 16, Abram and his wife Sarai decide to take things into their own hands. You see, they're getting very old, and Sarai says, I'm not able to have children, so I want to make sure that you receive the blessing that God has promised you. So I want you to sleep with my slave, Hagar. And now this is the point where I need to stop and say that just because something happens in the Bible doesn't mean that the Bible condones this thing. And slavery is a big aspect of that. And also it's a very common practice in this time, in this culture, to say, oh, I'm unable to have children. Well, I'm going to have my slave take my place, and she will have an heir on my behalf. So it'll be my heir, but it'll be through her. This is a very common and, in hindsight, very terrible practice because Sarai is essentially offering for Abram to take advantage of her slave, Hagar, sexually and force her to have this child, which now looking back today, we can obviously say this is bad. It's a little more difficult for someone in this culture to realize such a thing until God steps in and says, actually, that was not the plan. That was not okay. And so God says, let's try this again. I'm going to rename you Abraham, and your wife Sarai, Sarah. And he also institutes the practice of circumcision. This is going to be a reminder for the time that you decided to take my promise into your own hands. And now God is having to clean up this mess. There's now this new child introduced into the mix that is semi-legitimate heir to Abraham, depending on the culture and the perspective that you look at it. And yet this is not the heir that God promised to Abraham. And so God promises Hagar that he will continue to take care of her and her son, and turns over a new leaf with Abraham and Sarah after renaming them and saying, we're going to start this again. That was not a very righteous thing of you to do, Abraham. And honestly, it gives me a little bit of hope knowing that God is still willing to suffer through Abraham's shortcomings, because that also means that God is willing to suffer through my shortcomings. Between the birth of Ishmael and Isaac, we get this narrative that kind of shoots off from the main story, where God appears to Abraham along with two angels. And he tells him, I'm actually going to destroy the city of Sodom because their wickedness is affecting the people around them. Just like what happened with Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, God is intervening. And at this point, Sodom is past the point of reconciliation, and he's saying it needs to go. And we come to this intriguing narrative where Abraham is going back and forth with God, pleading on Sodom's behalf, please don't destroy them. If there's any way, if there's 50 righteous people or 40, 30, 20, 10 righteous people, would you please promise not to destroy them? And God knows that, unfortunately, there is no one who meets such qualifications in Sodom. And he's helping Abraham to realize this. And then Abraham realizes that his nephew Lot is still present there. And so we shift perspectives now to Lot, who is living just outside the city gates of Sodom. He's parked himself as close to the line as possible without going over it. And yeah, he's still there, still not. And it's not a place that you want to be when you're facing temptation. You want to be as far away from temptation as possible. And yet, the culture of Sodom has definitely had an impact on Lot and his family. And we see this very plainly in the following narrative, where the people of Sodom want to take advantage of these angels that are staying in Lot's home. And in order to be hospitable, Lot offers up his daughter to be raped instead. It doesn't quite make sense. And yet this is the culture of Sodom. This is what Lot has subjected himself and his family to. And you can see that it has twisted his mind. And eventually the angels get Lot and his family to leave their home, and yet Lot's wife looks back and turns into a pillar of salt. And I've done a fairly deep dive on what this means, this turning into a pillar of salt. And it seems to be pretty literal. The word pillar could mean monument, almost like this is what it means when you are looking back and longing for what was, even though it was something that was harmful to Lot and his family. It's a very confusing thing. It's a fun little question mark to have. And it's one of these things that it's okay to have this question mark. We don't need to have all the answers, because it's a mystery that is still yet to be solved, that we get to continue to engage in the text. And as we finish chapter 19, we see this narrative of Lot and his daughters. They are, again, also twisted by this mindset of Sodom. And so they decide to get Lot drunk, which, number one, is a mark against him for allowing himself to get drunk in this situation. And then also, the daughters decide to take advantage of him. And it's this whole messy, incestuous situation taking place in these caves because they're afraid that their family line is going to end. And yet, even though we're starting to see this divide more clearly, where Abraham is pursuing righteousness and Lot is pursuing destruction, Abraham is still continuing to mess up. Remember that first story that we read about Abraham and the Pharaoh and passing his wife off as his sister? Well, he's going to try to do the same thing again. And it plays out just as poorly. And it's like, Abraham, what are you doing? Come on, man. Every time things start to not go in your favor, you revert back to who you once were. But despite that, God still carries through on his promise, and Sarah gives birth to Isaac. And unfortunately for Hagar and Ishmael, Sarah has no more use for them. She has an heir of her own at this point, and she starts to once again abuse her slave. So Hagar and Ishmael, for their own safety, are sent away, and we get this really sad narrative where they are about to die in the desert, and God sees and cares for them and provides them with water so that they can survive and live on. What's kind of wild is that God provides this water for Hagar, and at the same time, Abraham has to deal with this dispute with Abimelech over a well, a source of water, where all of a sudden a well of water has gone missing. It's been seized, and neither side knows exactly what happened, but this water, this source of water, is a point of contention. And so it's very clearly from a narrative standpoint, maybe not a literal standpoint, but God has taken water away from Abraham, the abusive family, and given it to Hagar and Ishmael, the abused family. And that brings us to a culmination of events in Genesis 22, where Abraham is tested. And if you grew up in Sunday school, you might be familiar with this story where Abraham is asked to sacrifice his son Isaac, which animal sacrifice is a very common thing in this era. Human sacrifice, a little less so. Definitely not common with the Most High God, maybe in some surrounding cultures. But this is kind of an out-of-character thing. And God is kind of pushing the limits with Abraham to see how far is he actually willing to go. God has suffered through Abraham's ups and downs and righteousness and selfishness for a long time. And so he's at this point where it's like, I have given you this son, and now I want to see if you will choose the path of righteousness or of selfishness. So I'm going to ask you to give up the thing that I said I would bless you with. And luckily, Abraham chooses the path of righteousness. He is willing to sacrifice his son Isaac, and God provides a substitute. And that should begin to paint an image in our mind of a father who's willing to sacrifice his son. And also an image of God willing to provide a substitute on behalf of others. Because ultimately, generations and generations down the line will come to Jesus, who is both the substitute and the sacrifice. And then we start to fast forward to the end of the story of Abraham. Sarah ends up passing away in chapter 23. Their son Isaac gets married in chapter 24. And then Abram passes away in chapter 25. And this is where we're going to pick up in our next video, starting in chapter